Capcom recently announced a brand new Onimusha game called Onimusha: The Way of the Sword. Its main protagonist is Miyamoto Musashi, which follows the game's trend of taking real-life samurai and putting them into this supernatural setting. When I found this out, I had this as my calm and reasonable reaction. There was also something else I thought to myself. In this game, filled with magic, otherworldly gauntlets, superpowered demons, and all sorts of other supernatural phenomenon, I thought to myself, I really hope they don't downplay how strong Musashi was. Because, as the title suggests, the strengths and feats of Miyamoto Musashi, known as the greatest swordsman of all time, are like that of an anime character. If I were to give him an anime plot, it would be the trope of an overpowered isekai protagonist, or an overpowered character from a fantasy setting that was brought to our reality, only they did not lose any of their strength. I know this is the internet, and hyperbole rules above all, but I'm not using hyperbole. The man was not in a league of his own, he was in a dimension of his own. So there's no wondering where I'm sourcing this information. This book, Miyamoto Musashi, His Life and Writings by Kenji Tokitsu, is where most of my information will be coming from, and I have read it from cover to cover at least 3, possibly 4 times. Not counting all the times I would open it up to read a specific section of the 488-page book. I've read a few other books, but for reasons not important to this video, they were not as reliable as the main book. Miyamoto Musashi is the reason why the 2 main playstyles I like in any RPG game is either a dual wielder or a spell sword. He is why I named my cat Musashi. It is also why my action figure of myself, which I will not explain, has me dual wielding swords. The necklace I wear around my neck is the family crest of Miyamoto Musashi. Though for full transparency, I began to wear this before I found that it was his family crest, but finding that out solidified for me that I'm never taking this guy off. This deep love and passion I have for his legacy and his works is why I can safely say I know things that you will not find on Wikipedia or some ChatGPT created YouTube video. And I can separate the various myths from the documented evidence, because that is the main crux of this book. What was documented by other people about Miyamoto Musashi. This includes the good as well as the bad, such as what the truth is of his famous battle on Ganryu Island and Sasaki Kojiro. This moment is considered the peak of Miyamoto Musashi's life, and many works of fiction, such as the famous novel titled Musashi by Eiji Yoshikawa, having that moment be the climax of his journey. But that wasn't the climax of Miyamoto Musashi's life. That was his turning point. And the reason why it's his turning point can be found in the documents by multiple other observers of the duel. I will explain why the other versions, while much less flattering of the perfect image of Musashi, are more likely to be true, why I think it makes him all the more human and completes his journey, and why I think the second half of his life, which I consider to be vastly more important, is often overlooked for this arbitrary pause in the retelling of his life. With the introduction out of the way, let's dive into the history of Miyamoto Musashi, the real-life anime character. This building you're looking at is a Budokan, a dojo for swordsmanship essentially. It was built in the year 2000, modeled after the old Japanese samurai helmets. This Budokan, according to Wikipedia and the articles it borrowed from, was dedicated to the official martial arts of Japan. It brings together all the traditional kendo schools. It is built in the province of Mimasaka, which has a long history of Japanese swordsmanship dating back centuries. This building was made to unify the Japanese martial disciplines not only in practice, but also historically and culturally. Out of all the possible names they could give this building, out of all the samurai that have lived in Japan, the person they decided to name this important building after was Miyamoto Musashi. This was not an arbitrary decision. It was built in the same town that he was born and opened on May 20th, the date of his death. On paper, Musashi was anything but an ideal samurai. He frequently broke unwritten rules and codes for warriors of his age, the most famous of which is he would show up to duels hours late, and he would badmouth many other schools and disciplines. He never became an official vassal or lord, which is why he was labeled a lifelong ronin. But that's not to say he had nothing to do with lords, but we'll get into that later. So just speaking in terms of principled ideals of what a noble, honorable, self-sacrificing Japanese samurai was supposed to be, they could have found someone better. But in terms of reaching the pinnacle of swordsmanship, in terms of being called the greatest swordsman who has ever lived, there could be no one else but Miyamoto Musashi, a man whose battles and achievements have reached levels that border on parody when you read them. Onimusha is not the first game to have Musashi in it. There's been multiple games where he has been the main character or a featured character, in numerous different variations. This is Miyamoto Musashi. This is Miyamoto Musashi. This is Miyamoto... Japan, I swear to God. There's references galore throughout anime as well, from the more obvious to the obscure. In Pokemon, Jesse and James' real names are Musashi and Kojiro. Kojiro again being the opponent he faced on Ganryu Island. This manga and movies, I could go on, but this is not a video on his media references. This is a video on how the man is basically an overpowered anime character in real life. So let us dive in and explore a man that has been labeled the greatest swordsman in all of Japan. Peerless under the heavens, invincible under the sun, the swordsman, Miyamoto Musashi. Historical records dating the time of Musashi's birth in Japan, in the midst of their brutal civil war, were hard to come by and keep track of. We technically don't even know for sure who Musashi's father was, or if the man that we say was his father was dead by the time he was born or died many years after. While no document states it as a fact, we can look at the whole picture and conclude whether or not he was his real or adopted father. Musashi's birth name was Benosuke, and then later changed to Shinmin Takezo, and was raised by Shinmin Munisai, a samurai famous in his own right, not just in his use of the sword, but the jite. What is the jite and why is it relevant to Musashi? Think of the jite as the original sai. Its purpose was to capture an opponent's sword and allow one to disarm or, well, disarm their opponent. This means that the jite was held in one hand while the sword was held in the other. Now why would that be relevant to the swordsman who built his style around wielding two weapons at the same time? There's certain combat techniques and ways that one moves one's body while wielding the jite in one hand and the sword in the other. Techniques that Musashi seemed to borrow heavily from and use, as well as describe in his most famous work, the Gorin no Sho, translated as the Book of Five Rings. Note I said most famous, not only. The first work he ever produced, The Mirror of the Way of Strategy, was written when he was between the ages of 21 and 24, and has a whole section about using the jite. I bring this up because I must dispel the common notion that Musashi was entirely self-taught. It would make no sense for a samurai to not train his son, and would explain why Musashi knew how to use a jite, as well as shuriken, but more on that later, and why Musashi went with a two-sword, dual weapon style. So he did receive some form of base training in his youth, contrary to the popular romanticized idea of him, but this isn't to take Musashi's feats away from him, as he left his town to become a wandering samurai by the age of 15. So from that age on up, Musashi was indeed almost entirely self-taught. Though we should rewind a little bit, as that's not the first major moment of Musashi's life. Before he even left the village, Musashi, as a child, had his first duel to the death. When did Musashi's first duel take place? When did he get his first kill against another trained samurai? At the tender age of 12. Yes, 12 years old. Do you know how young and small that is? Go to Google right now and look up 12-year-olds. Actually, don't do that. He was, in our time, a 6th or 7th grader who fought a trained warrior and won. And he didn't even have a real sword. Imagine a 12-year-old taking on a full-grown professional MMA fighter who had some level of renown already around him. That was Musashi's first duel. Some clarifications and devil's advocate for this particular moment. You'll notice I say 12, but most other sources you look up will probably say 13. That's because of how we view age compared to how they viewed age. For us, after a full year of being alive, you are 1 year old. For them, the moment you are born, you are 1 year old, or the first year of your life. I'm using our modern day aging method so you have a clearer picture going forward. As for the duel itself, the samurai was in a bit of a lose-lose situation. Musashi provoked him, as the samurai put a sign in town asking for a duel, so Musashi painted the sign black and put the time and date. The samurai could have either left and ran away from a 12-year-old, which I'm sure would go over well in a society with a heavy emphasis on honor, or he could have killed a 12-year-old, which I'm sure would go over well in a society with a heavy emphasis on honor. While he was still trying to figure out whether the kid was serious or not, Musashi got the jump on him. According to the account, the samurai drew his short sword, swung, Musashi ducked it, crashed into him, used the throw that he later describes in his Book of Five Rings. It should be noted the account of his throw was written before the book was, and then beat him to death using his wooden sword. I suppose also to be fair, Musashi was described as being 5'10 or 5'11, some putting him as tall as 6 feet. As an adult, which in feudal Japan made him a giant. But we don't know if he got his growth spurt at age 12 or not. For context, the average Japanese during this time was around 5'3", and samurai were probably only a couple inches taller thanks to better nutrition and genetics. Think of the guts of this 12-year-old charging into a sword, continuing his attack, and beating someone to death with a stick. Musashi left town to become a wandering samurai at age 15. At that point, you're typically considered an adult at that age, but becoming a wandering samurai at that age, in the midst of a civil war, was not that common. He had his next duel at that age, but we have no details on that fight written anywhere, aside from the opponent's name, that he was strong, and Musashi killed him quickly. It wasn't just single duels that Musashi was involved in. This being a time of civil war, battles were commonplace as well. Musashi, over the course of his life, took part in 6 battles. 4 of those 6, he was in the vanguard, or in other words, on the front lines. One of the first to clash with the enemy. 3 of those 6 battles all took place in the same year, when he was 16 years old. The first, in the year 1600, was an attack on a castle in July. The second, 1 month after that, was a defense of a castle which had been encircled. The third battle of this year, arguably the most famous battle in all of Japan, Sekigahara. The battle that was the climax of the Japanese Civil War that had been raging for over a century. A battle that, from start to finish, lasted about 8 hours. Full of samurai that had been through numerous life and death battles before. Battle-hardened warriors who were putting everything on the line. And Miyamoto Musashi, at 16 years old, was on the front lines. Not just on the front lines, but on the front lines of the losing side. And survived. Not just survived, but didn't even sustain any serious injuries. I don't know if he got any cuts here and there, but he certainly didn't lose a limb. He kept both of his eyes, and it most likely would have been said somewhere if he needed 17th century stitches anywhere. Personally, I think the battles are more impressive than the duels, and here's why. There may be some ethical questions raised on some of his duels. Whether or not the way he conducted himself could be considered moral or just, using things like sneak attacks, aggravating his opponents, or throwing his swords at people, which he was known to be a master at, are all things that I guess could give people an argument of, well, he wasn't being fair and he wasn't fighting somebody at the top level. But to survive so many battles at the front lines at such a young age and live to keep fighting, there is no denying that level of skill and ability. So far we've had one-on-one duels, and we've had battles of many against many. But what about one versus many? The next major milestone of amazing feats is his duels against the Yoshioka school. Musashi, from the age 12 to the age of 29, had over 60 life and death duels. That's one duel every 2 months, not counting the battles. There's no need to cover every single one we have documents on, but the tale of Musashi versus the Yoshiokas is a tale that every retelling of Musashi must include. First, let's hype up the Yoshiokas. Who were they? They served as swordmasters to the Ashikaga shoguns before they fell in 1573. To be the main branch of samurai to the shogun in the midst of wartime is no easy feat. Your skills and abilities would be constantly tested, and failure generally resulted in death, either by the enemy's hand or your own. Their heads of the clan were involved in battles as well, and they maintained a high degree of respect and a high place in society even after the shogun they served fell. So these were not some back alley hicks. These were the all-stars, elites. At this time, there were 8 high-ranking schools in Kyoto, and the Yoshiokas were at the top of that list. Such a school would often get challengers, people looking to make a name for themselves, and after a certain point, it would become tedious. So a raggedy, no-name samurai like a 20-year-old Miyamoto Musashi wouldn't normally get their foot in the door. So what changed here? Musashi's father once dueled the head of the Yoshioka school in front of the shogun, and won 2 out of 3 bouts. This shows that his father, who would have spent at least some time teaching him between his own travels, was no slouch, and samurai clans were known to hold a grudge over things like this. The head of the entire school, Yoshioka Seijuro, accepted the duel. The rules for this duel were thus: they would use wooden swords, and there would only be 1 strike each. On the day of the duel, Musashi used a tactic that became synonymous with him. He arrived at the duel late. The disrespect was immense, not to mention a severe breakage of basic samurai etiquette. But Musashi didn't care. He did it specifically to rile his opponent up. He was a severe critic of samurai at the time, saying that many have lost their way, and they treated their swords as a way to make money instead of a way of life, and that they had grown too used to only swinging their swords in their own dojos. In the duel, they both swung once, as promised. Musashi hit Seijuro in the shoulder so hard, it knocked him out. According to documents, he even stopped breathing and had to be revived. He lost the use of his left arm and proceeded to retire. He handed the school over to his younger brother, shaved his head, and became a monk. His younger brother, Yoshioka Denshichiro, could not accept such a blight on their honor and reputation. Some no-name 20-year-old defeating the head of the top school in Kyoto? What a joke. So, as a matter of pride and revenge, he challenged Musashi to a duel without the previous rules, and Musashi accepted. Denshichiro used one of his favorite weapons, which was either a staff reinforced with steel rings, or what is called a chigiri, a Japanese flail. Whatever the weapon, Musashi used the same tactic as before, arriving late to the duel. This time, in the midst of battle, Musashi took away his opponent's weapon and hit him with it, killing him instantly. The Yoshiokas were not going to take this lightly. Their reputation was destroyed. They needed a way to restore their honor. They needed to kill Musashi. They chose the eldest son of their first leader to become the newest head of the dojo. At a mere 11 years old, he was just a figurehead. Or, for Musashi, bait. When Musashi was to show up, the entire school was to attack him all at once. Depending on the documents you read, the number of students varied. Some even placed it at over 100. Even the lowest still has it around a few dozen. Students numbering in the 70s is the most common number I've seen. These men were not just armed with swords. Some were armed with bows and even rifles. They were not gonna take any chances this time around. Musashi must die. Musashi received a challenge from the 11-year-old boy and accepted. But this time, he knew something was up. For this duel, or more accurately, this slaughter, the Yoshiokas assumed Musashi would once again arrive late. Only they didn't know Musashi's other rule for combat. You can do something twice, but never a third time. So for this event, Musashi showed up early and found a place to hide and wait. When no one was expecting it, Musashi jumped out of his hiding spot and immediately cut down the figurehead 11-year-old of the Yoshioka school. He chose him, probably the least threatening, as his first target because he knew of the mental and psychological toll it would take on the rest of the students, seeing their leader cut down, now for the third time. Without skipping a beat, Musashi began his assault on the remainder of the Yoshioka school. One single man with his two swords against a group of over 70 trained, battle-hardened warriors, some armed with bows and guns, and Musashi won. Do you see yet what I mean when I say he is an anime character? One man versus 70. That's not something that's supposed to happen in real life. To be fair, we don't know if Musashi cut down every single member who was there that day, but we do know that, immediately after this event, this main branch of the Yoshiokas dissolved, and their entire school followed shortly after, all by one man. Even if Musashi did not cut down every single member, there are certain assumptions we can make. First of all, the 11-year-old would have most likely been surrounded and in the middle of the group. They would not have let Musashi approach from an unguarded side. Even the most simple-minded can figure this out, let alone a school for warriors who had just come from a civil war, with skirmishes still taking place here and there. So if Musashi was in the center, he would have to face numerous opponents, even if he went one direction and ran away from the rest of the people. But running away would not be feasible, as there would be people with bows and guns who would shoot you in the back, and would shoot their own comrades in order to strike you down, with those comrades probably considering an honor to die for their school in such a way. So he would have probably had to circle back around and take out the long-range people before he could even make a safe getaway. All the while, every single other enemy would be rushing directly at him. Even if he did not kill every single warrior, such a feat of combat, and to be able to escape afterwards, is unimaginable. He almost doesn't seem human, and he's only 20 years old. There was actually a movie made about this battle, Crazy Samurai Musashi, 400 vs 1. It showcased the entire multi-man fight scene in a single shot. Unfortunately, it did get a little bit repetitive, and I would not recommend it outside of Musashi fanboys like myself. Needless to say, taking out the entire school of the Yoshiokas really cemented Musashi's legacy. Word of his name spread, and he was becoming a legend even then. At this point forward, Musashi would take part in many more duels, but before that, there are a few things that should be laid out to give a more accurate picture of Miyamoto Musashi as a human. We talked earlier about how the notion that he was entirely self-trained is most likely false, as he must have gotten some basic training from his father at an early age. Those would be just the basics though. He was given a view on the structure of training and techniques, and the wilderness became his main teacher. There's also this notion that he was a lone samurai, forever a ronin. That's an unnecessary romanticization. As mentioned before, Musashi fought in battles, and he was on the sign his family name was assigned to. He stayed as a guest art instructor to multiple feudal lords. Man had to make money somehow, and he did seek to be a permanent instructor for the right lord. He never had any biological children that we're aware of. To be thorough, there is one source that claimed that he did have a child later on in life, and it's the only source I've seen who has claimed it. And it's given me reason to not believe in what it's saying in the book. So until another source comes out and says the same thing, I'm gonna end up not believing it. But he did adopt 3 children over the course of his travels. This will be very relevant for the next section. He had his style, and his school for the 2-sword style. And obviously, a school has students. That is why Musashi's school lives on to this day, because he had multiple students to carry on his lineage, and his most famous work, the Book of 5 Rings, was written for them. There's a famous anecdote that says Musashi never took a bath. There is one source that claimed that, but only one, and they also made some other claims that we can say were factually untrue, like how his hair used to be so long and went down to his waist. We have portraits of him. He was bald. Also, if he was willing to forgo baths to perfect his style, then surely he'd cut long hair that only serves to get in the way. With the many important people Musashi met in his life, we would have more records if he smelled, and he'd be turned away a lot more often. It also went out of line with his spiritual side. Yep, I said spiritual side. There's a common notion that Musashi was some sort of stone-cold atheist. Most tend to attribute this to one of his writings where he said, "Respect the gods and the Buddha, but don't rely on their help." Too many focus on the don't rely on their help part, but sadly miss the respect part. While Musashi may have received training from his father, he was not raised by him. He was instead raised by his uncle, who was a monk inside a temple. Musashi did receive religious teaching, and did incorporate its principles into his swordsmanship. The Book of 5 Rings uses the elements fire, water, earth, air, and void for its 5 main chapters. Those are the same elements used in Buddhist cosmology. I'm not a Buddhist, but I am a Taoist, and let me say that those elements within the cosmology are fundamental building blocks. Musashi, for this piece of work, would not have chosen the 5 elements on a whim, and when we get to the writing of the book, you will see even more evidence that this was not something he took lightly. It was in the less glamorous, less written about second half of his life that these teachings and spiritual practices, such as his study of Zazen meditation, really began to take root. But why would his life take a sudden shift halfway through and pivot in this direction? Because of what happened in his most famous duel on Ganryu Island. At the age of 29, Musashi had his final one-on-one duel to the death with Sasaki Kojiro. It is the event that is the climax of almost every story told about him, from novels to movies to video games. They all follow a general view of the same account. The duel was scheduled in the morning on Ganryu Island, which at the time was named Funajima. Musashi, in usual fashion, decided to arrive very late. On the way to the duel, Musashi grabbed an oar, took out a short sword, and began to cut himself a wooden sword. He arrived on the scene as much as 4 hours late. Kojiro was livid. Musashi dragged the long oar behind him in the water, so Kojiro could not see its length. He tied a headband around his head as he calmly walked towards him. Kojiro, in a fit of anger, unsheathed his longsword and tossed the scabbard into the water. Musashi simply smiled and told him, "You have already lost. If you thought that you could win this duel, you would not toss your scabbard away." Kojiro charged at Musashi in a rage. He was known for using an exceptionally long sword, and with it, he swung down at Musashi, who took a step back. The headband he put on was split in 2, showcasing how much of a master of measuring distance Musashi was. He immediately counterattacked with a strike of his wooden sword, made from an oar so it was longer than even Kojiro's sword. He hit him on top of the head, killing him instantly. And as far as contemporary media is concerned, Musashi did nothing for 40 years until he wrote the Book of 5 Rings. First, let's talk about some of the background behind this duel, and some of the problems of this account. We can't go into a big history lesson, but the duel was ultimately arranged by the Hosokawa family. The Hosokawa family has been feuding for power with the Sasaki family. It has been speculated, but not confirmed, that Hosokawa pushed for this duel to take out Sasaki Kojiro, who had been in numerous duels himself, and also invented his own style, Ganryu. Keep the name Hosokawa in the back of your mind, and maybe you've already taken note of the name of Kojiro's style and started to ask some questions. After this duel, Musashi established significant relationships with a number of vassals of Hosokawa, which is more likely to have happened if he was used to achieve a greater purpose than merely entertaining by having a duel in his presence. Why was this duel held on a remote island? Why make everyone go out of their way? The duel had restricted viewership, and it was agreed that no disciples on either side would be present for this duel. Those are odd requests and restrictions to have. And finally, why was the island renamed to Ganryu Island? To commemorate the style of the loser of the duel, and not after the victor or his style. We'll get back to these questions. Oars are made of very hard wood, not easy to cut through with a knife, while on a rocking boat. To think Musashi would attempt to get his weapons ready in a way that would tire out anyone's arms mere hours before the duel goes against his character. It's also a bit of romanticization of how Musashi was able to hold a giant, heavy wooden sword, dragging it into water in order to keep its length hidden, and tie a knot in his headband without skipping a beat. It's the same reason why folks should not believe the account of him never taking a bath. They needlessly romanticize something, namely his hair length, for no reason but to make him seem grander than he is. You don't need to hype up Musashi like that. In 1654, there was a monument erected to Musashi called the Kokura Monument, set up by one of his adoptive sons, Miyamoto Iori. It contains an overview of Musashi's character and his many feats and exploits. It also contains a brief explanation of the fight, but it states, quote, "The two adepts found themselves at the same time on the island of Funajima." So this monument, erected by friends and family, does not say he arrived late. And again, this is something Musashi did all the time. They would have no reason to take that part out for this duel, but not all the others. It also does not contain any of the details, such as the headband, or the tossing of the scabbard. There was another account from a witness to the duel. This one is from a witness from the Numara family. They are largely unimportant, except to bring about the fact that they have relation to the Hosokawa family. So it would be in their best interest to be more biased in favor of him and Musashi. Here's what this account said. It was agreed that none of the disciples of either party would be present at the duel. Kojiro lost the duel and died. The disciples of Kojiro did not come, as per the agreement, but Musashi's disciples came covertly. After the duel, Kojiro revived, but Musashi's disciples arrived and killed him. Kojiro's disciples, learning this, arrived in a group on the island. Musashi fled amid the dangers as far as Moji, where he came to ask protection from Lord Nobumoto, who took him to his castle to provide him with a secure situation. Later, he sent Musashi to Bungo. By the Lord's order, Ishi Mitsunojo succeeded in taking Musashi to the house of a man named Munisai in the neighboring region of Bungo. On horseback, he led a group of riflemen who provided security for Musashi's journey. This text was written for the sole purpose of documentation. The most popular account that everyone is familiar with is from a biography on Musashi, which might have a vested interest in covering up what sounds like the darkest moment of his life. There was another account written in 1715 in a book called Little Tales of the Martial Arts in Japan. The account is not by a witness, but of someone who heard the account from his elder. We don't know if this elder was himself a witness, or if he heard it from a witness. But in this lengthy account, it also mentions that while Kojiro's students did not show up, Musashi's were already on the island. There was another book on Musashi written in the 1980s that took a deep look into this and came to the same conclusion that the less than ideal version of events make more sense. There was political turmoil between Hosokawa and Sasaki clans, so ensuring the death of Kojiro made sense. At this point in Musashi's life, spirituality played a very small role next to combat, in which the ultimate goal was victory, something he would have surely passed on to his students at this point. Both possibilities, mentioning Musashi's group attacking, make sense. If this is what happened, it would also help explain why the island was named Ganryu, after Kojiro style, as a show of sympathy and honor for a man who was wrongfully butchered. If this version of events happened, it would also provide a good explanation for why Musashi's path suddenly changed. He stopped having one-on-one duels to the death, though it was far from his last duel overall. We can't discount Musashi's own words on this, written in the Book of Five Rings. At the age of 30, I reflected and saw that although I had won, I had done so without having reached the ultimate level of strategy. Perhaps it was because my natural disposition prevents me from straying from universal principles. Perhaps it was because my opponents lacked ability in strategy. I continued to train and to seek from morning till night to attain a deeper principle. When I reached the age of 50, I naturally found myself on the way of strategy. He does not mention anything that would indicate the secondary view of events is true, though giving a long caveat about his final duel to the death would not have really fit in with the flow of the book. Despite my love of Musashi, I feel like I would be doing him a disservice if I did not at least mention this unfortunate event. But it, in a way, shines its own light on the man, helping remind us that the one who achieved such unimaginable heights was indeed still human. He was not a cold-blooded killing machine. And if you saw your own students butchering a man after a duel, like animals, you would take a second look at yourself as well. It's understandable why media like novels or video games would rather take the more common approach to this duel. It makes them look cooler, no doubt. And if you had to write out all the other events we listed so far, including those we didn't, you'd want your story to have a conclusive ending. If you go with the bad ending like we described, that would not be satisfactory to the audience. At the very least, they would demand a sequel to know how things turned out. Funny thing is, it's a shame they don't produce that sequel, because the stories that will come out of it, while shouldered, are arguably even more impressive. Well, that is just what I'm going to do as we continue the journey of Musashi into the second half of his life. After the duel with Sasaki Kojiro, the remaining years of Musashi's life saw him maturing. He began to settle down, at least as much as a wandering samurai could settle down, and also expand his repertoire into other fields. One thing that you would find throughout Musashi's writings is that, as he explains, everything he says has applications for the big as well as the small. What works on one opponent will work on 10,000, as above so below if you would. When you learn the underlying principles of what you are doing, it will apply to anything and everything else. This is a passage from a historical document called Writings on Lord Ogasawara Tadasane. Quote, "Next to the third building of Akashi Castle, there was a long piece of abandoned ground, the development of which was entrusted by the lord of the famous Miyamoto Musashi. This piece of land was transformed into a garden in which there was a fountain, some miniature mountains, trees, flowers, a tea house, and also a field for playing ball. He had alpine plants brought in from regions of Miki and Akashi, and stones from Awa, Sanuki, and the island of Shodo. Work on this lasted for a year. On the previously mentioned Kokura monument, it is written, he was well versed in all artistic domains. Moreover, there was almost nothing he did not know regarding the arts of craftsmanship and construction." Considering multiple lords either took Musashi as an advisor or entrusted him outright in land and city development, as well as his referencing of Kampatri in the Book of Five Rings, it's easy to believe this. There are several pieces of art from Musashi still with us today, paintings as well as sculptures. When he partook in these activities, he wasn't moving away from his path of the sword, he was deepening it. This is one of the main reasons why I myself have tried to be so well versed in my own activities, including when I dedicated my life to the martial arts. It was while I was still practicing that I opened up my tea store, and why I did not stick to just tea, but moved on to roasting coffee, making soaps, why I have multiple novels and stories sitting and waiting for me to focus on, why I started to learn Unreal Engine to make a martial arts inspired video game, why I run a YouTube channel. For me, these are not all separate activities. They are all connected to the whole of my being, and the path I walk, even if that path has taken some unfortunate, drastic turns. I don't feel like doing a long segment of self-promotion like I usually do. The last part kind of did for me anyway, so if you want to buy the items I create, support the channel, or any of those future projects, check out my website in the description. Let's get back to the video. During the second half of his life, he wasn't just painting pretty pictures and doing fun landscape projects. He was running his school, calling himself the greatest adept in Japan, and staying with various feudal lords. That sort of thing will make a name for you, in a land where people seek those who have made a name for themselves to challenge you, so they can make a name for themselves. The first thing I want to get out of the way is the least interesting post-Kojiro duel he had. I say least interesting because there's two completely different accounts of what happened, and I don't care to go over both of them. But what they have in common is that a man by the name of Miyake Gunbei, a vassal for the lord of Himeji Castle, was ordered to either prove Musashi's boasting of being the best and bring him in to become a vassal, or kill him for being so full of himself. Well, Musashi lived on, but what is most important is that so did his opponent. No life-threatening injuries, no crippling him, the worst he got was a cut on the cheek. This was the start of Musashi's new way of fighting. And to be perfectly clear, by the laws of dueling at the time, if Musashi killed him, he would have been completely justified. He chose not to kill him. This was the start of Musashi's new way of fighting. If you thought he was an insane anime character before, he takes it to even further heights, by now fighting and defeating opponents who are trying to kill him without taking their life. Much like how each of his 60 duels to death were not written down and documented, every duel Musashi had while running his school and being guests for various lords was now written down either. They most likely would have been if he killed anyone, but he didn't. With that in mind, let's take a look at a chronicle of one of Musashi's duels in front of not just a lord, but a daimyo, and son of the shogun who unified Japan after the Civil War, Tokugawa Ieyasu. So again, this is not some hick lord, this is the son of the shogun, and as such, only top tier swordsmen would be around him. The passage in this document reads, and at the lord's request, he fought 2 adepts of the fife. For this combat, Musashi chose 2 wooden swords. Against his first adversary, Musashi adopted the cross sword guard position and advanced toward him. His opponents backed away, pushed back by the energy emanating from Musashi and his swords. Being unable to get away from the points of Musashi's swords, which were directed at his face, he was pushed all the way to the wall. Once he had his back against the wall, he was forced to back along the whole length of the dojo wall until he ended up having gone around the complete circumference of the hall. Musashi said, "My lord, such is my way of fighting." He prevailed over the second opponent the same way. Do you understand what happened? I will put it in anime terms for you. Musashi's aura was so overwhelming, he pulled a Zaraki Kenpachi. He pulled an Orochimaru during the Chunin exams. He was Frieza going 50% power. He was Jiren's getting the Super Saiyan out of Goku. My man did not need Ultra Instinct because his opponents couldn't even attack him to give him the opportunity to dodge. Imagine a UFC fighter who was so powerful that he won his matches against seasoned veterans without making a move because they were too intimidated to make a move on him. That's the level Miyamoto Musashi reached. There was another example of his level of skill, as he had a formal duel, again organized by Ogasawara, involving an adept of the lance, Takeda Matabe. The lance could come in various forms. I don't know which one was used, just that it was bamboo and Musashi used the usual wooden swords. Takeda did not wish to duel, but was compelled by the lore. They had 3 bouts. Musashi easily won the first 2. Then, on the third, to help his opponent save face, he maneuvered the lance to slide between his legs, declaring if it was real, he would have lost. But onlookers knew what was up, and Takeda confirmed it himself that that's what Musashi did. So he's not able to just beat elite opponents with ease. He is able to maneuver them in a way so that he can feign losing without getting injured. Another example, this time with a warrior named Matsudaira Naomasa, who fought in multiple battles, was recorded as having killed more than 30 enemies by beheading them, and was praised by Tokugawa Ieyasu himself. His entire lineage is a famous samurai. For anyone who's played the Samurai Warriors games, you may recognize these 2 characters. They carry the Naomasa name, so that is the lineage that this man came from. He was granted lordship and turned his fief into a place for people to practice the martial arts. He too encountered Musashi, who was 53 years old at this point, far from a spring chicken, and had Musashi duel one of his top vassals, who used the staff over 7.5 feet in length. Musashi, a bit out of character at this point in his life, launched the first attack, getting past the length of the staff, smacking both of his hands and then his head, knocking him down. Matsudaira was pissed that his vassal lost so easily, so he decided to challenge Musashi himself. Musashi did his trademark, making the opponent go around the length of the arena as he pushed him back with nothing but his aura. This was done over the course of 3 duels, and on the 3rd duel, Matsudaira finally mustered the courage for an attack. Musashi attacked his sword, broke it in 2, and broke it so fiercely the wooden part that broke flew into the ceiling and got stuck there. Matsudaira was no longer upset at his vassal and became a student of Musashi. This is crazy to say after everything we've talked about so far, but this next recorded bout is arguably the most unbelievable, and it is at the very least the one I personally have a hard time accepting. Not to say that I'm saying it's false, but well, let's get on with it. At the last part of his life, Musashi decided to settle down in the fief of Higo as the guest of a lord named Hosokawa Tadatoshi. Hosokawa had a vassal named Shioda Hamanosuke, who used to be a student of Musashi's father. They had a classic duel, Shioda using a long staff, but Musashi only using a short sword. Every bout ended because Musashi kept preventing Shioda from doing anything. Anytime he would try to move, Musashi would counter and prevent him from completing the move. Finally, Musashi made the surreal proclamation. He told Shioda that, for the last duel, it will be a jiu-jitsu match. Musashi would sit at the center of the dojo with no sword. He said if Shioda could even get within a distance of about 6 feet of Musashi, sitting unarmed, he would be declared the winner. This angered Shioda, who took him up on his challenge. He was, as it was written, unable to cross the line Musashi had indicated, as though there were an energy field around Musashi's body that protected him. It's one thing if he had weapons on him, but unarmed, and all he had to do was get within a distance? It's been 20 years since I first read this biography, and it's still hard to wrap my mind around it. But, again, Musashi was not in a league of his own, he was in a dimension of his own. There was one final duel that we know of, against one by the name of Uji Yashiro. Uji was given the rank of master by Yagyu Munenori, who was famous across the land, having invented one of only 2 schools recognized by the Tokugawa shogunate. Another opponent that was no mere amateur, and another opponent that Musashi defeated without even having to deliver a single blow. He was 55 years old. Musashi had achieved the highest possible level of a martial artist. He was able to defeat opponents without even having to attack. It is a feat that, as far as I'm aware, we have not seen before or since. It is a feat that I cannot even wrap my mind around when I look at any form of combat sports today. Someone so powerful that even as an old man, their aura was so strong that professional fighters would give up or would be unable to land a blow, so they gave up after feeling so inadequate. Oh, something I left out. A little before this final duel, Musashi was involved in his 6th and final battle. It was during this battle that Musashi took the most serious injury of his entire warrior's life. He got hit in the shin with a stone. It made walking painful, so he couldn't visit a lord, but wrote a letter to him instead. You'd think his noteworthy feats would stop after he finished fighting, but there is one more. Lord Hosokawa, the last lord to take in Musashi, and grew to be a close friend, died. This was devastating to Musashi, and he wrote that the late lord liked strategy, and I was able to teach him and communicate to him the overall mind of my school. That was my greatest happiness. His death caused me to lose hope. Musashi had grown sick. Even a man of his stature could not escape the final fate of death. About 7.5 miles from the fight, Musashi traveled to Mount Iwaro and stayed at Reigando Cave. It is there that he began to write one of the most profound books that has ever been written on martial arts and strategy, the Book of 5 Rings. Sick and dying, he traveled 7.5 miles to be in a secluded cave. To the west, you could view the sea. The cave was surrounded by several waterfalls. On the inside, there was a shrine dedicated to Kannon, also known in China as Guan Yin, the goddess of mercy worshipped by Buddhists, Taoists, and other sects across many cultures. Outside the cave, there were 500 statues of stone, and stones put together in the form of towers that were 5 stories tall. It is not a mere coincidence that, out of all the possible places he could have picked within an 8 to 10 mile radius of his home, he chose the place with 500 statues, and stones stacked 5 stories tall, to write the Book of 5 Rings, with the chapters reflecting Buddhist cosmology being overlooked by the god or goddess of mercy. It's why, when he wasn't writing, he was practicing meditation techniques like Zazen. Even though contemporary writings don't portray him as such, Miyamoto Musashi was a deeply spiritual man. He became considerably weaker after finishing the Book of 5 Rings. Sensing his death was imminent, he chose to die at Reigando Cave and let his friends, lords, and students all know. A week before his death, he also composed his second most famous work, the Dokudo, The Way to be Followed Alone. This book was more about attitude and outlook than it was on strategy and combat. He died in the presence of his adopted son Iori, as well as his disciples. But even in death, he leaves us with one final feat of amazement. His manner of death was outlined as thus. At the moment of death, he had himself raised up. He had his belt tightened and his wakizashi put in it. He seated himself with one knee vertically raised, holding the sword with his left hand and a cane in his right hand. He died in this posture at the age of 62. Before his death, in matters of his burial, Musashi wrote, "I served and received great favors from the 2 lords, Tadatoshi and his son Mitsumasa. After my death, I will protect the peace of the Hosokawa family as thanks for the favor these lords showed in my regard. I wish to be able to bow to my lord when he travels to Edo to render his duty to the shogun. Would you be so kind as to choose the location of my interment in a place that will permit me to fulfill these wishes?" And so, Musashi's hair was buried on the mountain, and his body was donned in his battle armor and buried just outside of town, so he too can fulfill his obligations, even beyond the grave. It's not difficult to see why Musashi's legend lives on even to this day. He wasn't a mythological legend, written in 3000 BC about a being who lived 5,000 years before that. It would be easy to dismiss his accomplishments at first glance, as they are so far and away beyond what we would expect a human being to be able to accomplish. But the amount of people, at different years and locations across all of Japan, who have written down in official capacity of these feats, makes it too unlikely that every single one of them was lying. At the very least, you can't really lie about eliminating a top-tier sword school located in the imperial capital of your nation by killing most if not all of their members and expect no one to call you out on your BS. This is why I hoped in the beginning of these videos that they would not make the mistake of underplaying Musashi's strength. The man was magical even without the Onimusha gauntlet. How can you put the man we've spent so much time describing into a video game when he isn't so broken and overpowered that it just becomes unfun? If he's able to take on 72 seasoned warriors without so much as a scratch, or at least any notable wounds, what's there to fear from 5 or 6 demon skeletons? If his aura is so fierce that he's able to keep elite fighters at bay even when unarmed, what kind of ferocious creature would be needed to feel like a viable threat for this man? The original point of this video was to showcase the feats and accomplishments of Miyamoto Musashi, and I feel like I accomplished that goal. Throwing in the anime character spin and Onimusha was somewhat clickbait. I certainly didn't lie, he is like an overpowered anime character, and I did have that thought about him after the Onimusha trailer. What I really wanted to talk about was the man. His feats and accomplishments were certainly godly, but the connective tissue of those feats and surrounding landscape he was in, I wish would get more attention. Truth be told, this video used to be over an hour long, with the final 20 minutes or so being me talking about what Musashi meant to me on a personal level, and giving more historical and cultural context and nuance to make him look even more amazing than he already is. But it felt like unnecessary bloat. There's only one part from those ramblings that I wish to carry over. One of the secondary reasons for making this video is how much I have disliked the representations of Musashi as some crazed madman in media, and I especially don't like how his entire second half of his life is seemingly forgotten and ignored, despite just how important it is in showcasing the man. I hope, with what I presented so far, that I have given people enough to view Musashi in a new light, and to give people an extra feeling of pride and excitement when you play as him in Onimusha 4. Want more martial arts related videos? Check out my video on the greatest martial arts anime, or see my best of playlist for more videos like this. Buy yourself some nice tea, soaps, or coffee from my website, The Dragon's Treasure, a business going on 10 years strong. Like, comment, subscribe, and while I feel this video won't exactly pop off, if you've made it this far, I sincerely mean this. I appreciate that my works end up being watched in full. Thank you.